The Minecraft world was once ruled by giant mobs who towered over treetops and hunted prey with their terrifying abilities. Journey with us as we dig up their fossils and uncover the truth of Minecraft's oldest mob. Our story begins eons before the first Minecraft players spawned in, before many of the mobs we know today even existed. Blazes, turtles, snow golems, and creepers can trace their lineage back to these four types of monsters that roamed the prehistoric lands, leaving massive fossils for players to find thousands of years later. Colonia, the ancient turtles, would have dwarfed our modern-day versions. Ignices, sometimes referred to as the mountains, spread fiery terror that makes blazes look like a joke. The ice giants we call megadiptes were formidable predators that could freeze their prey before devouring them. But none of these compared to the oldest and most powerful creature of all. Throughout history, it's been called many things, including Creepasaurid, Tyrannoblox, and Gloombrute. But its true name was Procursus, the Green Terror. Fossil records indicate that this was the last of these terrifying ancient creepers, which could create an explosion up to 20 times larger than today's creepers. Even more astounding was the fact that Procursus was able to survive these explosions, using them to hunt prey and intimidate his opponents. Naturally, the other massive beasts of the ancient world learned to avoid him, instead fighting amongst themselves for food and territory. They required large quantities of prey to sustain their oversized bodies, resulting in each mob guarding its own massive hunting ground. The solitary nature of these creatures meant that they often lived and died alone, leaving fossils spread far apart from each other across the Minecraft world. The locations of fossils found today tell us that these mobs preferred living in arid deserts, watery swamps, and the soul sand valleys of the Nether. These fossils are invaluable when it comes to learning about Procursus and his prehistoric kin, and a recent find has completely changed everything we thought we knew about them. Deep in the desert, buried in sand that had been unmoved for centuries, lay 8 incomplete but distinctly separate skeletons. Archaeologists were baffled by this find. Individual fossils are most often found on their own, miles away from their nearest neighbors. It wasn't uncommon to find the skeletons of 2 creatures that had died in combat with each other, and on rare occasions, 3 skeletons could be found together. But this many fossils in such close proximity had never been discovered before.
How? Why were they so close together?
These archaeologists correctly thought that each of these ancient titans were enemies, but they didn't know that these particular creatures had been forced together by a foe even more fearsome than themselves. Each of the ancient titans had lifespans long enough to outlast generations of other mobs, but Procursus was the oldest of them all. A careful study of his fossil revealed that he had no natural aging process. If not for an external force causing his death, he could have lived long enough to see the first players spawn in, just as he observed the birth of early villagers. He watched from afar as these cavemen learned about their world, crafting and using tools for the first time in history. They hardly posed a threat to Procursus, so he left them alone, hunting his usual prey of pigs and cows. The cavemen were completely oblivious to his existence, but they did notice the other megafauna that roamed the world. Some bold tribes attempted to bring down these terrible beasts, but often failed due to their primitive tools. The defenses that the ancient Ignices, Megadiptes, and Colonia had developed were too advanced for the cavemen to overcome. However, these early villagers possessed something that their giant enemies did not: perseverance. After watching their fellow men die, they resolved to hunt these beasts out of revenge, a more powerful motivator than the mere curiosity that had driven them before. They avoided the giant monsters of the world while they figured out how to bring them down. Over time, they grew smarter, and their hatred of the massive mobs grew too. After developing a primitive form of communication, they were able to hunt in coordinated groups. They practiced bringing down tougher prey, despite the fruits of their labor not being very rewarding. Their numbers grew too, and the extra swords proved very helpful in bringing down their prey. Finally, the advancement from wooden weapons to stone ones seemed like the last element they needed.
Now we go! Yeah!
Their first attempts ended unsuccessfully and with many casualties, but the survivors learned from each experience. Eventually, their persistence paid off, and the first ancient Ignis was slain. Some believe that its leathery hide was crafted into the first armor, both for protection and to show off the spoils of the kill. After the first tribe successfully brought down an ancient mob, many others followed. The giants fell, and after their flesh had been eaten, the skeletons remained to become buried and decayed. Over time, the land shifted to press these fossils deep into the ground. After centuries of pressure, the skeletons fractured and fossilized, transforming pieces of bone into coal and even diamonds that players can find today. The ability to slay Ignices, Colonia, and Megadiptes was a pivotal moment in the development of the early villagers. Unfortunately, it didn't go unnoticed by the Green Terror. Procursus observed his ancient brethren being slaughtered all over the world, and something shifted within him. His sense of competition with these beasts was replaced, at least in part, by sympathy. As the years passed, his sympathy turned to pain, and pain into rage. When he looked around, he saw the fallen bodies of beasts who had walked the earth with him for hundreds of years. It was then that Procursus resolved to do something about these violent cavemen who had emerged uninvited into his world. The Green Terror earned his name in the years that followed. No cavemen had previous knowledge of his existence, let alone his terrifying abilities, so they had no chance to defend themselves. Procursus ran from cave to cave, wiping early villagers out with his massive explosions. If any survived the first blast, he would chase them down and fire off another. Tunnels and tight spaces weren't an issue for him. His ability to carve blocks out of his way was unparalleled. Even the cavemen couldn't change their environment to their liking at the speeds Procursus could. They were caught off guard by a creature that showed intelligence beyond the others they'd encountered.
Why you do this? No, please!
Procursus tore across the world, wiping out every caveman he encountered. He was even able to stop a few active attacks on ancient mobs, saving them from death. After interrupting the villagers' hunt and destroying them, he showed concern for those whose lives he'd saved. This was confusing to them, because for centuries they'd known the Green Terror as a merciless killer, but they were grateful all the same. By observing one such interaction between Procursus and an Ignis, a surviving villager learned what his motive was. This moment of kindness between the giant beasts was all he needed to understand why his tribe had been attacked. He remained hidden until both monsters had left, then pulled his aching body toward the neighboring villager camp.
Must warn, no more death.
After informing them of Procursus's attack on his people, he took shelter in their cave to heal. The neighboring cavemen were thankful for the information and used the opportunity to form a plan. If what the Green Terror cared about were his fellow giant mobs, then they had to capture some to get leverage. Only then could they secure their safety, but that was easier said than done. Hunting the beasts was within their abilities, but subduing them and trapping them against their will seemed nearly impossible. Using potions to weaken them wasn't an option, because they wouldn't be invented for several hundred years. Leads also hadn't been created yet, but even if they had, they wouldn't have been effective on such large creatures. Instead, they attempted to build traps, using themselves as bait to lure the mobs inside. Casualties were suffered, but they managed to trap 7 beasts, 3 Megadiptes, 2 Colonia, and 2 Ignices. Through a slow and perilous process, they shifted the cages into their cave, locking them against the rear wall.
Good, we safe now.
The tribe grew comfortable with the presence of their captives, and over time they became less afraid of Procursus too. They kept their trapped beasts alive by sending cows, sheep, and pigs into their cages to feed them. Months passed before the Green Terror arrived. When he did, they drew their weapons, but not towards him. Though they lacked a shared language, Procursus understood the threat and didn't dare attack the cavemen. The loss of 7 ancient lives would be too much to bear, and any attack that he made towards them would be fatal for the mobs he was trying to save. Thus, Procursus was forced to obey the wishes of the cavemen, which began only as a request to stop killing their fellow men, but evolved into much more. With the Green Terror under their command, the people of the cave quickly became the most advanced civilization of their time. Archaeological research has uncovered evidence that the cave tribe used Procursus to carve out large plots of land. With more room to expand, the tribe continued to grow, building simple structures out of dirt blocks. Procursus was also used to hunt smaller animals in greater quantities than the cavemen could have done on their own. This gave the tribe a steady supply of food, wool, and leather. With the burden of hunting lifted, the tribe was able to spend time developing intellectually. Their language quickly became much more advanced than that of other tribes at the time. Whenever Procursus would step out of line or disobey an order, the tribesmen would beat one of the other hostages, even going as far as killing them, only to replace them with another caught soon after.
You want us to get rid of another one? Didn't think so. Now listen up.
Procursus had no recourse but to obey his captors and bide his time. As these large creatures were slain, the tribe would repurpose their whole bodies to be used within the village. Using the large bones, they constructed fences to defend their land. The leather from their hides was plentiful enough to craft armor for every member of their tribe. With plentiful food and protection, their numbers grew until Procursus started to doubt his ability to eliminate the tribe. Even if they would move far enough from the captives for him to use an explosion attack, there would surely be survivors who would return to punish them. His compliance out of fear for the hostages had continued for too long, and he'd become just as trapped as they were.
Hey, what are you looking at? Get back to work.
The months that followed were the darkest in Procursus' long life. For all his power, he was unable to save the ancient mobs who'd shared the world with him for so long. Instead, he was helping their captors grow in strength and numbers at a dizzying rate. His spirit was so low, he made a decision he'd never considered in all his years. He knew that he was capable of unleashing explosions far more powerful than his normal attacks, but that he wouldn't be shielded from their devastating damage. Procursus believed that if he created one of these explosions near the villagers, they would finally be brought to an end, but so would he. It was a price he was willing to pay. After returning from a hunt, he approached the caged creatures while the villagers were busy rifling through their loot. By briefly charging an explosion, he tried to communicate his plan to them. From the tilt of their heads, he thought they understood and seemed hopeful, just as he did. The thought of using his power to destroy his tormentors was thrilling, even if it came at a price. Now that he knew the others felt the same, there was nothing standing in his way.
Hey, what do you think you're doing? You're going to kill your friends!
While charging his last explosion, the oldest mob watched the fear grow in each villager's eyes. Ending their cruel ways was the right decision, rather than letting them spread across the world. Procursus' last hope was that the future would be brighter after he was gone. The caged ancient mobs, Procursus, and the entire villager tribe were wiped out by the blast. The bones of the oldest mob and his brethren were all that was left behind to be unearthed 1,000 years later.